Hey, what's ready? Welcome back to the channel, and Happy New Year to everybody. It's now 2026, which is, quite frankly, hard for me to believe. We're ticking closer to that futuristic 2030 number, and, oh, Stranger Things just finished up after, 10 long years? I choose to believe in this case. If you know, you know. But yeah, today will be a bit different than usual. There's really not a lot of news floating around right now. Most companies are on their holiday break. But something that I've been wanting to do for a while is to look back at 2025 and give each of the big three a letter grade. So PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo. Now, how I'm actually going to do this, though, is that I'm going to look back at their first-party catalog, my own personal enjoyment with the console, and also how they ran their business. Before we get started, though, of course, I want to thank my supporters on Patreon and on YouTube memberships. I mean, for real, you all are awesome. I really can't thank you all enough. But as usual, you will receive this video through early access. Let's go and get right into things, though, and I'm going to start off with Nintendo because not only did they launch a brand new console in 2025, but the Switch 2 was actually my most played console of the year, or at least in terms of completed games. Since 2022, I've tracked every game that I've completed. I don't log the ones that I don't complete, so don't take my final numbers as the definitive amount of games that I played. But for the Switch 2, my completion rate was fairly high with 7 games completed in 2025, and I'm actually working my way through a few more as we speak. I also completed 4 games on the Switch 1, so I mean, in terms of software, Nintendo, in my opinion, had a really solid year. Donkey Kong Bonanza and Pokemon Legends ZA are some of my big highlights of 2025, and I get it. It's become popular to hate on the Pokemon series, but I genuinely really enjoyed it. I like the art style. It looks very clean on the Switch 2. I thought the combat was a lot of fun, albeit I do prefer the more turn-based stuff. And the story itself was a big highlight for me. I think it might actually be the best story in a Pokemon game to date, and that's what really took me by surprise. I was not expecting that. But, you know, at the same time, the city itself, admittedly, does feel limited, and repetitive for that matter, and the fact that they still don't have voice acting really stands out in a bad way. So by all means, it's not a perfect game, which is where I agree with the criticism, but looking back through 2025, it still stands out to me as one of my favorite games of the year, and I can say the same thing about Donkey Kong Bonanza, Metroid Prime 4, and even Mario Kart World. These were all good, fun highlights for me in 2025, and that's why I'm going to give their software a B+. Now, I would have gone with A, but I feel like Mario Kart World and Metroid Prime 4 didn't completely live up to their expectations, even though I still think they're good overall games. Now, I'm also going to give them a B for enjoyment, not only for those games, but I mean, the Switch 1 and the Switch 2 are my go-to platforms for JRPGs, which is one of my favorite genres. So games like the Lunar Collection and Trails in the Sky First Chapter are perfect fits for my taste on the Switch consoles. And I have to say, I've also really enjoyed the Switch 2 for its backwards compatibility. One of my favorite games of the year was actually Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, a game that I played on the Switch 1 in 2024, but I retired it early on because its frame rate was absolutely terrible on the Switch 1. Now, the Switch 2, however, completely fixes it, and it ended up being among my favorite experiences of the year. However, where I'm going to really criticize Nintendo is in terms of how they've done their business. Yes, they've been extremely successful. The Switch 2 is the fastest selling console of all time, so I'm going to factor that in. But from a fan's perspective, I don't like the game key card situation, nor do I like how they've tried to up the prices for games like Mario Kart World. It's the first $80 game, and I get it. They'll get away with it because of its brand power, but to me, they are taking advantage of their loyal fans, and I just don't like that. So I'm going to give them a C- in terms of their business. They've had success, so I'm not going to go any lower than that, but I really hope they address how they treat their fans in 2026. So with all that, their overall grade averages out to a B- for the year. Now, Xbox, though, they had a very interesting year because it's almost a tale of two halves, and the best way that I can explain that is to start off with their software. Because I think that if you look at their first-party lineup on paper and nothing more, you might come away thinking that they actually had a very good and active year. They released games like South of Midnight, there was Avowed, The Outer Worlds 2, Grounded 2, Ninja Gaiden 4, Call of Duty Black Ops 7, Doom the Dark Ages, Oblivion Remastered, and Tony Hawk 3+4. All of these games launched directly into Game Pass, and if you have Game Pass, you are eating very well on an almost monthly basis. So I'd say in terms of quantity, they were among the most active publishers, and because of that, I'm going to give their software lineup a B-. Now, I can see how some people might go higher than that, and because of that, you might ask, why won't I go higher? And that's because they didn't have that big standout game from one of their A-tier franchises to really round out their lineup. Instead, they had a lot of their B-tier type of franchises for 2025, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's also why I look at 2026 as being a bigger year for them, because if you look at 2026, we are going to get those A-tier franchises like Forza, Gears of War, Halo, and Fable. Now, in terms of overall enjoyment, though, I'm actually going to give them a C, because while I feel like they had a lot of solid games, a lot of 8 out of 10 type of games, which is, again, perfectly fine, and I can see how some people might rank them higher, but they also didn't have anything for me that necessarily blew me away that makes me look back in awe. A game of the year type of experience. The last Xbox game that did that for me personally was Indiana Jones back in December of 2024. Now, Oblivion Remastered probably should have been that game for me in 2025 because I love Oblivion, but its performance just left so much to be desired. And I just think that that's so unfortunate for a game that truly deserved better. Now, that will likely be fixed with their next generation console whenever that eventually releases, but I'm ranking them for this year and not for the future. So again, I think they had a good, solid lineup with some fun games, but they didn't have that one standout experience for me personally. And this is just my personal grade. You have to remember that. In terms of business, though, this is where I'm going to give them a D-. And that might sound harsh because they've had some success with their multi-platform strategy. I get that. But it's hard for me to go any higher because Microsoft's vision for their future not only has split their fan base, but it's also really hurt their console division and how fans view them. Yes, their games are selling well on PlayStation, but I have to ask, at what cost? To nobody's surprise, when you remove guaranteed exclusives and you raise the price of your consoles and Game Pass, that kind of impacts their platform and the mentality that longtime fans have for the brand. So it's hard for me to justify a higher grade than that. Again, though, I do think that their software has been strong, and I still think that Xbox has a ton of potential heading into 2026. They just need to rebuild some of that trust among their fan base. For 2025, though, overall, their letter grade averages out to a C-, mostly because of their business decisions. Now, lastly, let's talk about the PlayStation 5, which really has become the default go-to console for a lot of people in 2025 because Xbox, quite frankly, doesn't offer the same amount of competition as they used to. And that's too bad because if you look at PlayStation's software lineup, you can make a very real argument that it was the weakest of the three in 2025. They really only had a few games, which includes Ghost of Yotei and Death Stranding 2. That's basically it from their publishing label, which is such an odd thing to see from a company as prestigious as PlayStation. Their production has fallen off a cliff these past few years, but at the same time, I will say that despite them only having 2 games in 2025, Death Stranding 2, to me, was one of the best experiences that I had all year long. It is an incredible experience that I highly encourage everybody to try. It's emotional, it's deep, it's strange, and there's just no game out there that's quite like it. It is a one-of-a-kind experience, and I can't say that about a lot of games. So I'm not going to forget this one anytime soon. It is just incredible. And that's why I'm going to say that PlayStation's lineup was almost the polar opposite of what I said about Xbox. Sony didn't necessarily have the quantity, but because Death Stranding 2 hit me in such a profound way, I will elevate its score higher than what it maybe should get. I'm going to give the PlayStation 5 a C-. That's a little generous, but I'm going to give it a C- mostly because of Death Stranding 2. Like, they need to produce more content. There's no doubt about that. But as long as they have games that are high quality like this, and, last year's Astrobot, that does somewhat make up for the lack of consistent content. But at the same time, I can see how certain people would rank this a lot lower. Now, in terms of personal enjoyment, though, I'm going to go ahead and give them a B. Again, that might seem a little generous, but because Death Stranding 2 had such a profound impact on me, that's going to elevate the score. And also, the PlayStation 5 was my go-to third-party platform of the year. I did buy the PS5 Pro back in 2024, so I did purchase a lot of games for the PlayStation 5 this year with the idea that they would perform the best on the PS5 Pro, which kind of bit me a few different times. There were a few games that performed worse on the Pro, but overall, I spent a lot of time on the PlayStation 5 this past year, and that's why my enjoyment is fairly high. Lastly, though, is their business model, and I don't think that there's really too much to say here. They had a very straightforward year for the most part. Their prices have stayed fairly reasonable compared to the competition, or at least so far. But my one main complaint about them is that they do not communicate with their fans the way that they should. I mean, I can't think of the last time that they've had a truly good showcase for their fans. So I think their business strategy is fairly boring, but not necessarily detrimental. So I'm going to go and give them a C-, which puts their overall letter grade at a C+. So there you go. Nintendo received a B-, Xbox a C-, and PlayStation a C+. Let me hear your letter grades in the comments below, though. Did you agree with me, or do you think that I'm flat out wrong? I want to hear your opinion in the comments below. Anyways, though, that's going to be it for this episode. But until next time, make sure to subscribe, ring that bell, and peace out.